For decades, Burkina Faso stood at the heart of the Sahel's endless drought, a land where hope cracked under the same sun that baked its soil. But now, that same horizon is stirring with a different sound. The hum of irrigation pumps and the rhythm of renewal. Last week, Ibrahim Traoré stood beside India's Minister of Water Resources to sign what many are calling the boldest agricultural pact in Africa history, a $9 billion irrigation alliance that could change how the Sahel feeds itself. 12 vast water corridors will cut across the heart of Burkina Faso, powered by solar fields and engineered by Bharat WaterTech, financed by India's Exim bank. The plan? To irrigate 1.2 million hectares, revive local rice and millet production, and free millions of farmers from the chains of imported seeds and fertilizers. But this is not just an economic story. It is a political earthquake. Because for the first time, Burkina Faso's farming future will not depend on Western loans or IMF conditions. Instead, it will depend on South-South cooperation, where the water flows not from charity, but from mutual respect. Western analysts are calling it a quiet revolution. From the markets of Ouagadougou to the fields of Kaya, people are already calling it la Renaissance verte, the green rebirth. An old farmer told a local radio station, "For the first time, the water is ours." Those 6 words have shaken more than one capital in Europe, because if Burkina Faso can feed itself, it can trade on its own terms. And that threatens an entire model of dependency that has lasted for decades. If this story matters for Africa's future, press like and stay for the full brief. If you're watching from a farming family, type your city below. Let's see who still believes in soil. As irrigation channels begin to fill with new life, another current begins to move across the world. Questions, fears, and calculations. Could this $9 billion water alliance truly bring Africa's green revolution? Or will it open a new trade front that the West cannot control? At sunrise, the convoy rolled quietly into the town of Lumbila, just 15 kilometers from Ouagadougou. Engineers in blue coveralls unloaded crates marked Bharat WaterTech, Solar Flow System. Inside each crate lay the same dream that had once transformed India's own parched plains. A network of intelligent irrigation valves and solar-powered water hubs, the core of Burkina Faso's $9 billion partnership with New Delhi. The official announcement came at a ceremony streamed live across the Sahel. Traoré's speech was brief, measured, and proud. He said, "For generations, the hand that fed us was not our own. Today, we water the earth ourselves." Behind him stood rows of young Burkinabe technicians, graduates trained through India's Green Corridor Fellowship. Each had studied precision irrigation, soil mapping, and digital water sensors. They would now lead 12 mega-project zones stretching from Bobo Dioulasso to Dori. The scale is staggering. 1.2 million hectares of farmland linked by 9,000 kilometers of smart canals, each powered by solar fields producing over 600 megawatts. The alliance includes a long-term agricultural credit facility, $2 billion in low-interest financing for local cooperatives to ensure that control of the land stays in Burkinabe hands. This is not charity, it is design. The deal was signed not in Paris, not in Washington, but in Ouagadougou, with Indian engineers shaking hands with African farmers. For both nations, it marks a new era of mutual independence. India gains agricultural corridors for trade and technology exports. Burkina gains food sovereignty and water security. But for Western observers, the alliance is something else, a potential crack in their century-old influence over Africa's food economy. European seed and fertilizer corporations had long dominated Burkina's rural markets, supplying products tied to conditional credits. Now, with India's arrival, that grip begins to loosen. The Wall Street Journal described it as a shift from soft aid to hard strategy. An EU analyst called it a new green belt outside Western reach. Local reaction, however, has been deeply emotional. Crowds gathered near irrigation sites just to see the first channels open. An old woman dipped her hand into the running water and whispered, "It has been 50 years since the soil spoke back." For farmers across the Sahel, this is more than infrastructure. It is identity. Every drop flowing through these pipes tells a new story, one about dignity, control, and self-respect. But the new partnership also raises new questions. India's stake in Africa is growing fast, from energy to defense, from mining to agritech. Some worry this could simply replace one dependency with another. Others see it as an alliance of equals, nations once colonized, now building together. Traore, for his part, appears unmoved by speculation. In a press briefing, he said calmly, "Partnership is not surrender. It is the sharing of strength." He ended with a warning that echoed through every headline. When Africa waters its fields, no one else decides the harvest. If you come from a farming family or once worked the soil, write your city below. Let us see how many still believe in land and labor. The images from satellite now show a new pattern emerging. Grids of green spreading like veins through the Sahel. Each square represents not only a new crop, but also a new kind of sovereignty. In New Delhi, newspapers call it the Great Sahel Project. In Washington, it is being studied as a potential strategic realignment. But for most in Burkina Faso, it is something simpler. Proof that the nation's future will no longer depend on rainfall or foreign mercy. Hold the line. Write one word that captures what this moment means to you. Still, behind the optimism lies tension. Trade analysts warn that global supply routes may soon be redrawn. If India becomes the Sahel's primary partner in agricultural infrastructure, Europe could lose billions in seed and export contracts. Western think tanks speak of market destabilization, but ordinary Africans call it justice, long delayed. As Burkina's pumps hum through the night and canals carve new paths across the desert, another current is forming. Political, invisible, and unstoppable. But why are diplomats in Brussels and Washington suddenly calling for emergency trade assessments? What are they afraid this alliance might unleash? The first sign of unease came not from Africa, but from Brussels. Inside a closed-door meeting at the European Commission, an internal memo warned, "The Burkina-India Irrigation Accord may accelerate the erosion of European agricultural influence in the Sahel corridor within 36 months." Across the Atlantic, Washington analysts sounded equally cautious. One policy brief from the Atlantic Council read, "India is positioning itself as Africa's alternative development partner, not through debt, but through water." It was a polite way of saying that the old system of dependency was now under threat. At the same time, the IIMF's Agricultural Outreach Division quietly postponed 2 upcoming reviews on Sahel farming programs once tied to fertilizer imports from European companies. The timing was not coincidence. In Ouagadougou, Traore remained calm. At a press conference beneath a blazing afternoon sun, he said, "Every nation that wants Africa to remain thirsty should remember this. The river changes course when the dam breaks." His words spread across social media within hours. Across Africa, hashtags began trending. #WaterIsFreedom and #GreenSahel. Meanwhile, in New Delhi, engineers and diplomats toasted to what they called a southward monsoon. India's Prime Minister stated that this is not aid, it is alignment. For the first time, 2 post-colonial nations were shaping a partnership on their own terms, built not on pity, but on parity. Western media coverage grew sharper. One French outlet questioned, "Is India replacing France in West Africa?" Another warned, "Burkina Faso may be creating a dependency that looks different but feels the same." But inside Burkina Faso, those words felt hollow, because on the ground, the change was real. Farmers who once waited for seasonal rainfall now manage smartphone dashboards showing soil moisture in real time. Children who once fetched water from distant wells now attend irrigation schools built beside solar farms. One village elder described it best. "The white dust that once covered our roofs has turned to green mist. For the first time, we smell rain before it falls." The human impact was unmistakable. Fields that had been barren for decades now shimmered with life. Wheat, rice, and vegetables began flowing into domestic markets. The national grain reserve increased by 32% in 6 months. Prices stabilized. Confidence returned. Still, the deeper transformation was psychological. For generations, Africans were told that food security required Western assistance. Now, the proof of self-reliance ran through the fields like veins of light. Direct CTA. If this moment speaks to you, share your first reaction in one sentence. Do you see hope or risk in this alliance? As optimism spread across the region, subtle countermoves began. Western trade envoys proposed new monitoring frameworks for water and land projects. European banks offered fresh lines of credit, with technical supervision clauses. Traore declined them all. In a televised statement, he said, "Our soil will no longer be audited from abroad." That line became a rallying cry. Crowds gathered in Ouagadougou waving small buckets of water, chanting, "We audit ourselves." The symbolism was unmistakable. Water had become not only a resource, but a declaration of independence. But beneath the celebrations, a deeper current of tension pulsed through the Sahel. Western companies began to freeze certain supply contracts. Reports surfaced of logistical slowdowns at border checkpoints. It was as if the world's invisible networks had decided to test Burkina's resolve. Traore, however, appeared unfazed. "We have waited too long for permission to grow," he told his cabinet. "Now we will simply grow." Analysts began to whisper that this was no longer just an irrigation project. It was the birth of a new trade front, one that could redraw alliances across continents. India's engineers were not just building canals, they were building corridors of influence. And the West, once unchallenged in Africa's agricultural sphere, suddenly found itself out of position. Still, the greater story was not about rivalry, but renewal. The fields spoke louder than any headline, and as dusk fell across the Sahel, the sound of flowing water carried a single truth. The future was already here, and it was green. But if water is power, who will hold the valves? And what happens when the first harvest proves the world wrong? In the months that followed, the transformation was not measured only in tons of grain, but in the quiet pride of those who had once lived in drought. The Sahel, long treated as the edge of survival, was becoming the frontier of rebirth. Local cooperatives began forming at a pace unseen in modern Burkina Faso. In the province of Sicily, 3 villages merged their farmland into a 12,000-hectare irrigation cluster, powered by Indian-built solar panels. Young men who had once left for seasonal labor in Côte d'Ivoire returned home to work the fields. Women who had carried buckets from wells now operated digital pumps by touchscreen. The social fabric began to heal. Migration slowed. Village schools reopened. Local markets revived, not with imported goods, but with Burkinabe produce. It was as though each green field whispered the same sentence, "We belong to the land again." But these victories also carried political weight. The alliance with India had quietly shifted the foundation of West African diplomacy. Where once France and the IMF dictated water and crop policies, now regional ministers looked to Ouagadougou, for example. Traoré's Greenbelt vision became a talking point in Mali, Niger, and Chad, a model of agricultural sovereignty spreading like wildfire across the Sahel. During a joint AES summit in Niamey, a delegate remarked, "The age of aid is closing. The age of partnership begins." That single line captured the mood of an entire region. In Ouagadougou, government approval ratings rose to record highs. The Ministry of Agriculture reported a 38% increase in food self-sufficiency within 1 fiscal year. Local radio programs began broadcasting water bulletins, not warnings of drought, but updates on irrigation progress. Still, with progress came new forms of pressure. Western trade missions returned, offering joint supervision programs and market stabilization packages. but Traoré's government politely refused. The phrase independent management became official policy, written into the National Charter of Agricultural Development. Yet, beneath the optimism, there was a recognition of the challenge ahead. With independence comes responsibility. Maintaining $9 billion worth of irrigation infrastructure demands discipline, transparency, and local accountability. Traoré addressed this directly in a televised speech. Sovereignty is not the end of struggle, it is its beginning. The crowd erupted, chanting his name, but his tone remained grave. We must protect this gift, he said, from corruption, from carelessness, from forgetting why we started. Direct CTA. If you believe Africa's strength lies in its own hands, press like before you go. If you disagree, tell us why. Respectfully, clearly. The new irrigation corridors soon began to reshape politics beyond Burkina Faso. Regional parties in Mali and Niger adopted slogans inspired by the alliance. Water before debt, soil before sanctions. Across the Sahel, debates over resource control took center stage. For the first time in decades, water, not gold, not oil, became the new axis of power. International observers started using a new phrase, hydro-sovereignty. It described what Traoré had accomplished, the ability to use water as both shield and sword in the struggle for self-reliance. But as the world watched the Sahel turn green, quiet resistance brewed in the shadows. European think tanks lobbied for market oversight, while private companies sought loopholes to re-enter the supply chain. Some contracts were frozen, others quietly redirected to neutral partners. Traoré's response was measured but firm. He announced a new transparency initiative, requiring all agricultural data to be stored on servers inside Burkina Faso. Our fields, he said, will not be managed from the cloud. The spiritual dimension of the change could not be ignored. In Friday prayers and Sunday sermons, imams and pastors alike began referencing the miracle of water. Religious leaders described it as a sign, not of political triumph, but of divine justice. A village priest told a reporter, "Maybe God waited until we found courage to help ourselves." By mid-year, satellite images confirmed what no policy paper could deny. Nearly 400,000 hectares of desert had turned green. And yet, the true measure of this revolution was invisible. It lived in the hearts of people who now believed the future could be grown, not borrowed. But in the corridors of power abroad, new meetings were already underway. Europe, the US, and China were preparing their counteroffers. Would Burkina's green belt remain sovereign, or would the world try to buy the rain? In Washington, the Irrigation Alliance was not treated as a regional project. It was logged as a strategic disruption. A classified report from the National Intelligence Council, leaked to several media outlets, summarized it bluntly. India's agricultural diplomacy is rewriting West Africa's supply chains faster than expected. Western access to Sahel markets could drop by 40% within 5 years. For the first time, analysts began to discuss the Green Corridor Challenge, a phrase describing how nations like Burkina Faso and India were using infrastructure, not ideology, to realign power. At a Senate subcommittee hearing, one U.S. official admitted, "If this model spreads, Western leverage in African food policy collapses." Behind the rhetoric lay quiet concern. American agri-tech firms, long accustomed to exporting to the Sahel, saw their contracts reduced by half. European producers faced tariff discussions over water technology. France's agricultural exporters, already struggling with domestic protests, now faced the reality of losing Africa's fastest-growing farm market. India, on the other hand, framed the alliance as a moral partnership, proof that two former colonies could trade dignity for dignity. At a Delhi forum titled "Feeding the Future," a senior minister declared, "When nations learn to share water, they no longer trade chains." That message resonated deeply in the global South. Across Asia and Africa, leaders watched closely, studying the Burkina blueprint, a cooperation model without the political traps of debt or austerity. Still, skepticism persisted. Western think tanks warned that India's influence in the Sahel could carry long-term political cost. Some suggested that the U.S. might need its own Green Partnership initiative to maintain presence in the region. The irony was unmistakable. For decades, Washington and Brussels had encouraged African self-reliance. Now that it was happening, they called it destabilizing. If you want calm, fact-based Africa coverage, press subscribe now. We'll track how Washington and Delhi move next. Even China, long dominant in African infrastructure, began recalibrating its tone. Analysts in Beijing saw India's rise as both competition and complement. Africa's green race, one Chinese commentator wrote, will decide who owns tomorrow's water. But the U.S. media narrative shifted quickly. Major outlets started framing Traoré not as a rebel but as a reformer, the man who turned irrigation into independence. A former State Department official, speaking anonymously, said, "It's hard to oppose food and dignity. You can't sanction water." And so the question reached a new level. If water diplomacy could realign the Sahel, what might energy, trade, or digital networks do next? The irrigation deal was never just about crops. It was the first signal of a deeper geopolitical tide. But how long can one small nation hold its course between great powers? And what will Traoré do when the next offer comes? One that no leader has yet refused. As the sun lowers over the Sahel, the landscape no longer looks like the edge of the world. The canals shimmer gold in the evening light, and from a distance you can hear the low hum of pumps feeding the soil. The land that once begged for mercy now breathes on its own. In a village near Zinyare, a small boy stands at the edge of the new canal. His grandfather hands him a seed and says, "Plant it today, so tomorrow no one can say we waited for rain." That single gesture explains what no report or headline can. It is not just about irrigation. It is about inheritance. Ibrahim Traoré's irrigation alliance with India has become more than an engineering feat. It is a statement that sovereignty is not built in conferences, but in furrows and calloused hands. And perhaps this is what frightens old powers the most, that Africa's quiet revolutions now begin with water, not war. For the United States and Europe, the question remains, will they adapt to this new world of partnership or cling to a past built on control? The next decade may not be defined by missiles or sanctions, but by who can grow food and who must buy it. If this story gave you clarity, press like to lock it in. If it challenged your view, write your counterpoint. Calm, fair, and factual. In the fields of Burkina Faso, the first harvest from the new canals is expected within 6 months. It will not just feed millions, it will feed belief. The belief that a nation once dismissed as poor can turn its deserts into gardens. And as the green spreads across the Sahel, one truth becomes clear. The future does not arrive. It is planted. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré's vision touched you tonight, share this story, not for politics, but for memory. Because when a people take back their land, they take back their voice. May every drop of water in the Sahel carry this message forward. Africa will not wait for permission to grow. Could this $9 billion irrigation alliance truly spark a new trade front? Perhaps. But maybe, just maybe, it has already sparked something far greater. The return of faith in Africa's own hands.